Senator Fifield.
Thank you, Mr Acting Deputy President. Every senator knows that the system of support for Australians with disability is broken, and the Senate Community Affairs Committee, ably chaired by Senator Claire Moore, received more than 1,600 submissions, each of which made this point. The evidence received from witnesses again reinforced that the level of support a person with a disability receives depends on a number of factors, including the state they live in, whether the disability is congenital or was acquired, and if acquired, whether it was in the workplace, a motor vehicle accident or some other context. Workers' compensation and motor vehicle accident insurance provides coverage in some jurisdictions, but if you're born with a disability or acquire a disability later in life, it can be a different story. Waiting lists and queues. The result is, as we all know, that many people with a disability are left without the assistance that they need. And, Mr Acting Deputy President, that's something that I discovered when I took on this portfolio over 3 years ago. I had been operating on the assumption that I think many Australians operate under, which is that if you have had a disability in Australia, that you receive the care and support that you need. That's not the case, and it's something that people who don't have a friend with a significant disability or a family member with a significant disability often don't realise. And so I must say, when I took on the portfolio, the scales did literally fall from my eyes. And in the words of the Leader of the Opposition, Mr Abbott, and I quote, "The NDIS is an idea whose time has come." The Coalition agrees that Australia needs a new system of support based on need rather than rationing, with the entitlement for support going to the individual. The individual needs to be at the centre and in charge, able to pick the supports, equipment and service providers of their choice. This is the vision of the Productivity Commission's landmark report into long-term care and support for people with disability. This is the vision of the National Disability Insurance Scheme. And the Coalition has enthusiastically supported each and every milestone on the road to the NDIS. The Coalition supported the work of the Productivity Commission. The Coalition supported the $1 billion in the last budget. The Coalition supported the 5 launch sites. The Coalition supported the agreement between the Commonwealth and New South Wales for a full statewide rollout after the Hunter launch, and the Coalition supports this legislation. Mr Acting Deputy President, the Leader of the Opposition, Mr Abbott, has demonstrated his personal commitment to Australians with disability and those who care for them by dedicating the $540,000 raised by the 2012 Polypedal charity bike ride to Carers Australia. Along the 1,000-kilometre route, Mr Abbott met with people with disability, carers and disability organisations, and Mr Abbott has committed that the next 2 Polypedals will also be in partnership with and raise funds for Carers Australia. And any comments the Coalition makes about the NDIS in this debate are offered in a constructive spirit to help make the NDIS the best that it can be. The Coalition stands ready to work with the government to see an NDIS delivered as soon as possible, and the Coalition believes an NDIS can be delivered within the timeframe recommended by the Productivity Commission by a prudent government that manages well. Mr Acting Deputy President, the NDIS is a person-centred and self-directed funding model. It's aligned to the objectives of empowering the individual, removing government from people's lives and reducing red tape. The Coalition believes that the full implementation of an NDIS would be nothing short of a new deal for people with disabilities and their carers. We have to get this right. And because the NDIS is a once-in-a-generation reform that will unfold over the life of several parliaments, it should be the property of the parliament as a whole on behalf of the Australian people, rather than that of any particular political party. To get this right will require a very high level of consultation and attention to detail, not just now, not just in the launch sites, but from now until full implementation. The NDIS should be beyond partisan politics. And I should mention that the Coalition has, on occasion, been a little disappointed when some members of the government have claimed the NDIS represents quintessentially Labor values. It doesn't. The NDIS represents Australian values. It represents a fair go. It represents helping those who face extra challenges for reasons beyond their control, and I don't think any side of politics has a mortgage on these. The Coalition has called for the establishment of a joint parliamentary committee to be chaired by both sides of politics to oversee the establishment and implementation of the NDIS. A parliamentary oversight committee would lock in all parties and provide a non-partisan environment where issues of design and eligibility could be worked through cooperatively. And I think the Senate inquiry into the legislation chaired by Senator Moore gave a bit of an insight as to how such a committee, an oversight body on an ongoing basis, could operate. Mr George Christensen, the member for Dawson, has had a motion in the House to establish this committee for some time. Regrettably, the motion has not been brought forward for a vote. Myself and Senator Boyce moved a similar motion to establish the Oversight Committee on the 27th of June last year in this place, and the Government and the Australian Greens together declined to support that motion. Mr Abbott reiterated the offer to join in establishing a Parliamentary Oversight Committee in his Press Club speech on the 31st of January this year, saying, and I quote, "The Coalition is so committed to the National Disability Insurance Scheme, for instance, that we've offered to co-chair a bipartisan parliamentary committee so that support for it doesn't flag across the 3 terms of Parliament and among the 9 different governments needed to make it work." When the government has been offered the opportunity to embrace this genuinely bipartisan offer, it has to date declined to do so. This legislation gives the government another opportunity to correct this. An amendment was moved by Mr Andrews in the other place to give effect to this committee, which was not successful, and I will be moving a similar amendment in the committee stage to give effect, hopefully, to the establishment of a bipartisan oversight committee, and we do urge the government to accept this offer. Mr Acting Deputy President, it is important to note that every government in Australia and every opposition in Australia supports and wants to see an NDIS. It was a little disappointing that the Prime Minister didn't treat all jurisdictions as partners at the COAG meeting in July last year, and it was to the credit of the Victorian and New South Wales governments that they continued to negotiate in the face of some misrepresentation and reached agreement to host launch sites. I mention this because a cooperative approach is essential. There can't be a full NDIS without the states and territories. They are partners, and the fruits of a constructive approach were evident when Premier O'Farrell of New South Wales and the Prime Minister signed an intergovernmental agreement in December last year for a full statewide rollout after the Hunter launch project. The government should continue in a constructive approach in discussions with other jurisdictions to conclude further bilateral agreements. As I say, there can't be a full NDIS without an intergovernmental agreement with each state and territory. It's worth making comment in relation to those states that aren't hosting launch sites. The Productivity Commission never envisaged every state hosting a launch site and never saw the absence of a launch site as a bar to taking part in a full national rollout. Indeed, Premier Newman of Queensland has written to the Prime Minister with a proposal to be part of a full national rollout. And Premier Barnett of Western Australia has written to the Prime Minister proposing a joint Western Australia Commonwealth NDIS. Questions of funding do also need to be cooperatively worked through with the states and territories, and legitimate questions and due diligence should not be portrayed as a lack of commitment to the NDIS. For instance, while the Coalition emphatically supported the government's commitment of $1 billion to the NDIS in the last federal budget, there was some difficulty in reconciling that figure with the $3.9 billion the Productivity Commission said would be necessary over the forward estimates for the first phase of the NDIS. And we assume that the government will explain, account for this and make appropriate provision in the coming budget. The Coalition will, Mr Acting Deputy President, continue to place the NDIS above politics and is prepared to work with state and Commonwealth governments towards a better deal for people with disability. The bill itself establishes the framework for the National Disability Insurance Scheme and the National Disability Insurance Scheme Launch Transition Agency. This will enable the scheme to be launched and the agency to operate the launch in 4 sites across Australia from July 2013 and 5 sites from July 2014. The first stage of the scheme will benefit more than 20,000 people with disability, their families and carers living in South Australia, Tasmania, the Hunter in New South Wales, the Barwon area of Victoria and the Australian Capital Territory. The scheme will provide funding to individuals or organisations to help people with disability participate more fully in economic and social life through the provision of an entitlement enabling things such as equipment, supported accommodation or personal attendant care. The mechanics of the agency will be established by way of legislative instruments called the NDIS rules. These regulations, the NDIS rules, will further detail areas such as eligibility. The government released a discussion paper about the rules on the 1st of July 2013. However, rather than containing a draft set of rules, the discussion paper was a series of questions. This is significant as the bill itself is essentially a framework. It establishes the agency, the board, the chief executive and a general definition of eligibility. But the mechanics of the scheme will be established by the rules, and a recurrent theme in the evidence which was presented by witnesses to the Senate committee was that it was hard to offer advice or pose questions or to plan fully for the launch sites in the absence of the rules. The government released 7 sets of draft rules on the final day of the hearings of the Senate committee on Tuesday the 5th of March. These included draft rules for becoming a participant, draft rules for children, draft rules for privacy, draft rules for nominees, draft rules for supports, draft rules for registered providers and draft rules for plan management. These draft rules are still the subject of consultation with the states and territories and disability stakeholders, and the Coalition is studying them carefully. The government has also indicated that there are potentially dozens of batches of draft rules still to be released. These need to be released quickly to enable proper scrutiny and consultation. The risk, Mr Acting Deputy President, as always with this government, is in their capacity to competently implement. The interaction of 3 components, the NDIS bill, the NDIS rules and the operating guidelines for the NDIS Launch Transition Agency will determine how and how well the NDIS operates. The work of the Senate committee was critical and it should have been afforded the benefit of the full NDIS rules and the operating guidelines for the agency before concluding its work. It is difficult at the moment to develop a complete picture of how the NDIS will unfold because of insufficient information. And I must say I was a little bemused, Mr Acting Deputy President, today to read of the proposal to change the name of the NDIS to Disability Care Australia. I think the focus at this time should be on scheme design rather than graphic design, but it's not a point over which the opposition seeks to make a capital case. This legislation isn't perfect. The NDIS is a complex venture. Amendments after the introduction of the legislation to the Parliament were inevitable and to some extent reflect that the government has heeded the work of the Senate committee. The Senate committee process, I think, has again proven its worth through the inquiry which has taken part, and the government's undertaken to fully consider further the work of the committee. However, in the time available, neither the committee nor the coalition, for that matter, were ever going to be able to address all the zone issues. The onus remains on the government. The prime function in the time available really was to ventilate as many issues as possible. And while the coalition supports pardon me, the NDIS and the broad architecture of the scheme, and as outlined by the Productivity Commission, the detailed design of the scheme, the legislative drafting and the launch site implementation are and remain the responsibility of the government. The coalition had offered to be partners with the government in the design of the scheme and the drafting of the legislation through the establishment of a joint parliamentary committee to oversee the design and implementation of the NDIS. This offer wasn't accepted. Therefore, the coalition hasn't had the benefit of the information and opportunity such an ongoing parliamentary committee would have provided to work with the government on these issues. More needs to be done. There are questions that stakeholder groups have, and I'll just cite one as a representative example of the many, and that is in relation to polio survivors, people with late effects of polio. There are questions that many stakeholder groups are asking about how they will fit in to the NDIS, and if they don't, what will be the arrangements for them. So this is and will remain a work in progress. Mr Acting Deputy President, the legislation to give effect to the NDIS is in the Parliament due to a grassroots campaign by carers, Australians with disability and the organisations that support them. They came together, they decided enough was enough, they spoke with one voice and they declared, in effect, we're mad as hell and we're not going to take it anymore. I do want to acknowledge the support that that campaign has had from the Every Australia Counts organisation and acknowledge the work of the campaign chair, Mr John Della Bosca, and Kirsten Dean, who was the Deputy Campaign Manager for much of that time, and also acknowledge my good friend Ms Millie Parker, who always keeps me up to the mark and who I know has had a significant impact on Mr Abbott as well. But it is important to acknowledge the two main intellectual drivers of the NDIS, Mr John Walsh AM, partner at PwC, and Mr Bruce Bonyhady AM, the Chair of Urella and President of Philanthropy Australia. Without the determination, professional expertise and personal knowledge of these two men, it's unlikely that this legislation would be before the Parliament. Mr Acting Deputy President, I'm very pleased that the legislation is here before the Senate and that it is at this stage. The Coalition want the NDIS to be a success. The Coalition want the launch sites to run smoothly, and the Coalition wants this legislation to achieve the objectives laid out by the Productivity Commission. The Coalition stands ready, and I stand ready, to work with the government and with all jurisdictions to make the NDIS a reality. Australians with disability, their families, their carers and the organisations that support them have had to wait far too long for a better deal, and this legislation is a step on the road to making sure that they receive the deal that they so very much deserve.